Hope everybody's nice and warm because I myself froze when I came here this morning from Washington, D.C. It is a pleasure to be here with you today for the Summit on Capital and Minority Business Capacity Building. This theme is the core of issues that impact nearly every business in this room. I'd like to thank my friend Dr. Fred McKinney, the advisors, the senior management team, and the staff of the New England Minority Supplier Development Council for the opportunity to come here today. I'd also like to thank the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston and the many corporations who have supported this critically important summit. The state treasurers, Denise Napier, who unfortunately will not be here with us this morning because of illness, but Chip Flowers and Steve Grossman, who have been leaders in facilitating access to capital for minority-owned firms. I'd like to acknowledge Lynn Greenhall, who is Lynn here this morning? He may not be here, from the Tuck School of Business, who has a long and distinguished career in working with minority-owned firms. And Lynn and Jim Lowry just published a new book titled Minority Business Success, Refocusing on the American Dream, which is a book that I think all of us would benefit from reading. And finally, I'd like to thank all the members of the senior management teams of the minority-owned and operated firms who came here today to seek solutions on the issues that plague the minority business community. I greet you this morning on behalf of President Barack Obama and Secretary of Commerce Gary Locke, and I make speeches all over the country, and I got to tell you, I never get tired of saying I greet you on behalf of President Barack Obama. For 41 years, our goal at the Minority Business Development Agency has been to expand the U.S. economy and create new jobs through the often undervalued and underutilized minority business community. Depending on who you talk to today, the prognosis for the minority business community may be difficult and challenging, or may be a place of hope and opportunity. But when you consider the potential of minority businesses to create jobs, to participate in the current economy, and to be well positioned to participate in the future economy, which will be export-based, I can tell you that for minority-owned firms, the glass is indeed half full. The 5.8 million minority-owned and operated businesses in the United States contribute over $1 trillion of economic output to the U.S. economy. If you took this sector of the economy and separated it and called it a separate country, the minority business community would be the 17th richest nation on the face of the earth. These firms also provide over 6 million jobs directly to U.S. citizens, and through their presence create millions of additional jobs that would not be available to U.S. citizens without this business community being formed, being a part of the U.S. economy. And according to the U.S. Census, the number of workers employed at minority-owned firms, and this is the last census track, has increased 26%. And again, the track is from 2002 to 2007. That's a jump of 1.2 million workers who now find adequate employment at minority-owned and operated firms. By comparison, the growth with non-minority-owned firms, the job growth with non-minority-owned firms, was less than 1% for the same period. So we are encouraged, and we should be encouraged by the positive attributes that are occurring in the minority business community, but there are certainly still a number of issues that we have to concern ourselves with. And it should be noted that the success of the minority-owned business community, the minority business community, is really part and parcel to the success of the overall U.S. economy. If the minority business community does not realize its full potential, it is impossible for the U.S. economy to realize its full potential. And so there are two factors that we're going to discuss at this summit, this important summit. That's capital and capacity. And let me start out by talking a little bit about capital. Last year, MBDA also commissioned a study, because everybody likes studies. And our study was entitled Disparities in Capital Access Between Minority and Non-Minority Owned Firms, the Troubling Reality of Capital Limitations Faced by MBEs. And I'd like to take a moment and share some of the findings from the study, and some of these findings many of you are already aware of. Minority-owned firms are less likely to receive loans than non-minority-owned firms. And so when you look at minority-owned firms that are greater than $500,000 in gross receipts, minority-owned firms receive loans about 41% of the time. This compares to non-minority-owned firms who receive loans about 52% of the time. And when minority-owned firms receive loans, they actually have to pay more for that capital. During the analysis period, minority-owned firms were paying about 7.8% for the capital that they had, compared to non-minority-owned firms who are paying about 6.4% at the same risk level. So in other words, minority-owned firms, by virtue of their structure, by virtue of their presence, pay about 140 basis points more for capital at the same level of risk. Minority-owned firms are also likely to be denied loans more readily. And again, for minority-owned firms under $500,000 in gross revenue, these are the smaller, because we break it out between $500,000 or more and $500,000 and less. The loan denial rate was an astronomical 42%. For non-minority-owned firms of the same size, the loan denial rate was 16%. And another factor that influences capital is fear of being rejected. Among firms with gross receipts under $500,000, minority-owned firms minority entrepreneurs and operators did not apply for loans because of fear 33% of the time. That compares to non-minority-owned operators who did not apply for loans for fear of getting rejected 17% of the time. The real thing that really jumps out in our study was the issue of equity capital. Minority-owned firms receive between $3,000 and $7,000 of equity capital. Non-minority-owned firms of the exact same size and risk profile receive 60+% more capital. Same risk profile, same size of company. And all these statistics reinforce what we already know, and that is minority-owned firms are challenged when it comes to capital acquisition, and the playing field is still not level. Now let's talk a little bit about capacity. The average minority-owned firm generates $178,000 in gross receipts. The average non-minority-owned firm generates about $500,000 in gross receipts. What's of particular concern are African-American owned businesses, which generate about $71,000 on average in gross receipts, but they are the only subgroup that saw their average gross receipts drop from the most recent census tract to the prior census tract. In other words, it's the only sector that had a reduction in average gross receipts, which is a problem. And so what we have here is a dilemma. We have an issue that is part and parcel to the success of the U.S. economy that we have to address. And the Obama administration is keenly aware of the issues facing minority-owned businesses and have taken some steps to address these issues. And I'd like to share with you some of the things that our administration has done over the past couple of years to address these issues. What we focused on is making changes in the small business community, and as you know, the vast majority of minority-owned and operated businesses actually are small businesses. So one of the first things we have done since we came into office is to cut taxes 17 times for small businesses and minority-owned businesses. We have a zero capital gains rate tax for investment in small businesses. We put in place new deductions for health care for the self-employed. And we have new expense benefits which will allow companies to write off 100% of their machinery and equipment. We are putting the finishing touches on what's called the Small Business Lending Fund, which most of you are aware of, which will place $30 billion in the hands of small and community banks for lending to small and minority businesses. The Small Business Administration has dramatically increased its access to equity capital through the SBIC program. And my agency, MBDA, has increased capital and contracts for minority-owned firms by 85% since the administration took office. We are working on an interagency task force to promote government contracting for small and minority-owned businesses, and we have launched a secretarial level advisory board on minority business enterprises to provide the Secretary of Commerce and the President of the United States hardcore policy ideas to help